On the island of Orizon, a gentle mender named Vanya discovers a solitary star that blinks in perfect synchronization with his own heartbeat. As he tunes celestial radios and mends mystical objects, he realizes the star is responding to his melodies, though a strange static threatens the connection. Join Vanya and his companions as they uncover the breathing paradox of the cosmos in this atmospheric journey of rhythm and light. The color of loneliness. The music box was beginning to evaporate. Vanya held his breath, his lungs burning, as the edges of the brass casing blurred into a translucent sulfurous gas. He gripped the precision tweezers with a white-knuckled intensity, guiding a gear no larger than a grain of sand back into its housing. If he exhaled too sharply, the sudden displacement of air would scatter the object across the workshop like ash. He froze, becoming a statue in the dim light of the beacon, his eyes locked on the shimmering misalignment of the mechanism. The gear resisted, hovering a fraction of a millimeter from its spindle, vibrating with a frequency that made the tips of his fingers numb. Then, the music box pulsed. A wave of deep, saturated indigo erupted from the center of the device, slamming into Vanya with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a light, but a feeling. A crushing, suffocating loneliness that tasted of salt and old iron. It was the grief of a thing that had been forgotten in a drawer for a century, the hollow ache of a voice that had no one left to listen. The indigo bled into his vision, staining the edges of the workbench and the jars of clock oil in a bruised hue. Vanya's grip faltered, the tweezers slipped, and for a terrifying second, the music box began to dissolve further, its physical form flickering like a dying candle. His heartbeat spiked. The sudden surge of adrenaline acted like a hammer against the fragile equilibrium of the mending process. The music box reacted instantly, its brass plates rattling and emitting a high-pitched, dissonant shriek that mirrored the panic in his chest. Vanya closed his eyes, forcing himself to ignore the indigo void pressing against his ribs. He focused on the air. He forced a slow, rhythmic exhale, pushing the breath out through pursed lips in a steady, controlled stream. He imagined the air as a physical blanket, wrapping around the object, pinning it back into reality. Slowly, the rattling ceased. The indigo receded from his vision, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache in his temples. He didn't move for several minutes. He simply sat there, the silence of the lighthouse rushing back in to fill the space. When he finally opened his eyes, the music box was solid once more, though it looked exhausted, its brass muted. Vanya picked up a soft chamois cloth and began to polish the casing. He didn't scrub, he moved the cloth in slow, concentric circles, treating the metal as if it were bruised skin. His thumb rubbed against his index finger in a steady circular motion, a grounding habit that kept him from slipping too far into the object's lingering sorrow. He could still feel the ghost of that loneliness clinging to his skin, a cold residue that made the room feel 5 degrees colder than it actually was. Some objects do not wish to be mended, Vanya. They only wish to be heard. Sana's voice drifted through the workshop like a distant breeze, sounding as if she were speaking from the far end of a long corridor, though she was standing barely 3 feet away. Vanya didn't look up. He knew the tilt of her head, the way she listened to the currents of the lighthouse that remained invisible to him. He continued to polish the brass, his movements rhythmic and meditative. He knew Sana's cryptic nature. She rarely gave a map, only clues to the destination. To her, the repair was not about the mechanical function, but about the emotional resonance. The music box wasn't broken because a gear had slipped. It was broken because the weight of its own silence had become too heavy to bear. "It was drifting," Vanya whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the distant sea. "If I hadn't anchored it, it would have become air." "And in becoming air, it would have been free of the weight," Sana replied, her tone airy and devoid of judgment. "But you prefer the weight, you prefer the tether. Just be careful that the tether does not become a noose for your own spirit." Vanya finally paused, looking at the music box. He carefully wound the key, a silver protrusion that felt ice-cold against his skin. As the mechanism engaged, the box didn't play a song in the traditional sense. Instead, it emitted a soft amber melody of colors. Shimmering ribbons of gold and honey orange spilled from the vents, curling around the workbench and drifting upward toward the rafters. The light was warm, smelling faintly of dried citrus and old parchment. The crushing indigo of the previous moment was gone, replaced by a fragile, luminous peace that seemed to settle the dust in the room. Vanya watched the colors dance, feeling his own heartbeat slow to match the rhythm of the amber light. He placed the music box on the high shelf, nestled between a clock that counted breaths instead of seconds, and a compass that pointed toward the nearest memory. He lingered there for a moment, watching the amber glow fade into a steady, low simmer. The workshop felt momentarily whole, the equilibrium restored, but the lingering chill on his fingers reminded him that he had absorbed a piece of that object's grief. It was the price of resonant mending. The repairman becomes the bridge, and the bridge must carry the weight of the crossing. As the light outside shifted toward the deep purple of the Orizon evening, Vanya began the ascent to the lantern gallery. The spiral staircase groaned under his boots, the sound echoing upward through the hollow throat of the tower. By the time he reached the top, the scent of the air had changed. It was thick with the sharp tang of salt, and the metal-sharp crackle of static electricity. The wind howled against the reinforced glass, a chaotic symphony that usually drowned out all other sounds. Vanya stepped out onto the narrow catwalk, the cold air biting at his cheeks, and began the evening polish of the great lens. He worked with a focused intensity, rubbing the glass until it gleamed, his movements mechanical and sure. The lens was a masterpiece of celestial geometry, designed to project a beam that didn't just cut through the dark, but signaled to the things that lived in the spaces between seconds. As he worked, the horizon began to blur, the line between the timeless sea and the velvet sky dissolving into a single, seamless expanse of obsidian. Vanya stopped, leaning his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the surface in a small, translucent cloud. He looked out into the void, his eyes searching for the familiar markers of the celestial sphere. The stars of Orizon were not stationary. They drifted and pulsed in slow, undulating currents. But there, hanging just above the western horizon, was a single violet star. It was smaller than the others, a pinprick of intense, royal purple that seemed to vibrate against the blackness. Vanya watched it, mesmerized. The star wasn't flickering randomly. It was blinking in a precise, rhythmic cadence, a long beat, a short beat, a silence, and then a steady glow. Vanya froze. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his own heart beneath his wool sweater. He timed the blink of the star against the beat in his chest. 1, 2, pause, glow. The synchronization was perfect. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a mirror. Every contraction of his heart muscle was echoed by a pulse of violet light millions of miles away in the vacuum of space. The realization sent a jolt through him that felt like the indigo pulse of the music box, but instead of loneliness, it carried a terrifying sense of recognition. He wasn't alone in the tower, and he wasn't alone in the sea. Something in the deep dark was listening to his heart, and for the first time in years, Vanya felt the sudden urgent need to answer. The radio's dream. The celestial radio was a beast of vacuum tubes and oxidized metal tang, a towering monolith of brass that smelled of scorched static crackle in old libraries. Vanya gripped the heavy metal tang dials, his fingers slipping slightly against the cold surface. He twisted the primary frequency knob a fraction of a nullimeter to the left, and the speaker responded with a violent surge of white noise, a chaotic storm of static that sounded like 1,000 dead conversations happening at once. Beneath the roar there were whispers, fragmented syllables in languages that had no names, drifting in from the edges of the timeless sea. Vanya didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his ear nearly touching the grill of the speaker, searching for a thread of consistency in the madness. He closed his eyes, his thumb beginning its slow, circular rub against his index finger. He didn't just want to hear the signal, he wanted to inhabit it. Vanya began to slow his breathing, timing each exhale to the rhythmic pulse he had felt in his chest on the catwalk. He let the noise of the room, the ticking of a dozen disparate clocks, the distant moan of the wind against the lighthouse stone, fade into a gray blur. He sank into the meditative stillness of the mender, that hollow space where the self dissolves and only the object remains. Slowly, the jagged edges of the static began to soften. The white noise didn't vanish, but it shifted, rearranging itself into a haunting, melodic humming. It was a low, vibrating drone that felt like the sound of a deep-sea current moving over ancient basalt. With a careful, deliberate motion, Vanya reached for the small hand organ resting on the workbench. It was a modest instrument of polished mahogany and ivory, its bellows still smelling of cured leather. He didn't play a song, he played a question. He pressed a soft, corresponding chord, a minor third that hovered just above the frequency of the radio's hum, hoping to create a harmonic handshake. The sound was thin and fragile, a silver wire stretched across a void. He held the note, his breath held, waiting for the vacuum tubes to glow in response. For a moment, there was a perfect, shimmering equilibrium, a bridge of sound connecting the lighthouse to the violet star. Then the equilibrium shattered. The radio suddenly shrieked with a burst of rhythmic static, a sound so jagged and cold it felt like a physical blow to the sternum. It wasn't just noise, it was a rejection. The sound tore through the room, vibrating the glassware on the shelves and sending a sharp spike of adrenaline through Vanya's system. He recoiled, his chair scraping harshly against the stone floor as he tumbled backward. He landed hard on the floor, the breath knocked out of him, his ears ringing with a high, piercing frequency that refused to subside. He stayed there for a moment, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, his chest heaving, the taste of metal tang in the back of his throat. "The void is not empty, Vanya," a voice drifted through the air, sounding as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. "It is merely waiting for a question it recognizes." Vanya shifted his gaze. Sana was standing near the window, her form a pale, semi-transparent smudge against the darkening room. She tilted her head slightly to the left, her expression one of mild curiosity, as if she were listening to a wind that only she could perceive. She didn't offer a hand to help him up, she simply watched him with a gaze that felt like a cool breeze on a fevered forehead. "It felt like a warning," Vanya whispered, his voice raspy. He pushed himself up, dusting the grit from his wool trousers. "Or a correction," Sana replied, her voice airy and distant. "You are trying to speak with the star using the grammar of a machine. The star does not know the language of dials and tubes. It knows the language of the heart, and the heart is rarely linear." Vanya didn't answer. He couldn't. He felt a restless energy humming in his fingertips, a stubborn refusal to let the silence return. He returned to the radio, ignoring the tremor in his hands and the lingering ache in his ribs. For the next 4 hours, the world outside the room ceased to exist. He became a creature of precision and patience, his movements evolving into a slow, rhythmic dance. He adjusted the fine-tuning capacitor with the delicacy of a surgeon, his eyes locked on the amber glow of the tubes. He shifted the frequency by increments so small they were almost imaginary, listening to the way the static curdled and cleared. He stopped thinking in terms of music and started thinking in terms of resonance, seeking the exact vibration that would mirror the pulse of the violet star. His focus became a narrow beam. He noticed the way the dust motes danced in the glow of the vacuum tubes, the way the smell of static crackle grew thicker as the machine warmed, the way his own heartbeat had slowed to match the idling thrum of the metal tang coils. He was no longer operating the machine, he was a part of its circuitry. He adjusted a final dial, a tiny brass knob that resisted his touch, and then let go. The result was not a sound, but a sensation. The radio emitted a crystalline chord, a pure, unwavering tone that didn't just enter his ears, but vibrated in his very marrow. It was a sound of impossible clarity, stripping away the layers of the present until Vanya felt a sudden, piercing surge of memory, the smell of rain on hot cobblestones, the weight of a heavy gold watch in a palm, the sound of a lullaby sung in a language he had forgotten he knew. It was a chord of recognition, a sonic signature that felt like coming home to a house he had never visited. Breathless, Vanya stepped away from the workbench and moved toward the window. He looked up into the obsidian sky, his eyes searching for the royal purple pinprick of the star. As he watched, the violet light shifted. The steady, rhythmic blinking he had observed on the catwalk vanished, replaced by a complex, rapid sequence of flashes. It was a cascade of light. Short, long, pause, double blink. A visual mirror of the crystalline chord still echoing in his bones. The star was not merely mirroring his heart anymore, it was answering his melody in real time. Vanya leaned his forehead against the glass, a small, translucent cloud of breath fogging the surface. He felt a strange, humming warmth spreading from his chest to his fingertips, a sense of profound connection that terrified and exhilarated him. He had sent a signal into the dark, and the dark had spoken back. But as the star continued its complex dance, Vanya noticed a flicker of something else. A second, dimmer light beginning to pulse just beside the violet star, a pale, ghostly silver that seemed to be watching the conversation with an intensity that felt like a cold finger tracing his spine. The mirror of other skies. The roar of a cloud skiff engine tore through the silence of the shale beach, a guttural coughing sound that vibrated in Vanya's teeth. He had been standing by the gallery window, staring at the ghostly silver light that now clung to the violet star like a parasite, when the sound arrived. It wasn't the clean hum of a government vessel, but the erratic, sputtering thrum of a modified engine held together by prayer and metal tang wire. Vanya stepped back from the glass, his thumb beginning its slow, circular rub against his index finger, a rhythmic anchor against the sudden intrusion of noise. Down on the gray pebbles, the skiff banked sharply, kicking up a spray of salt-crusted grit before slamming into the shore with a jarring thud. The hatch hissed open, and Jamoka Adiemi leaped out before the vessel had even settled. She was humming a low, steady tune that seemed to push back the oppressive weight of the void, her laughter echoing up the lighthouse shaft. In her arms, she cradled a heavy object wrapped in deep, midnight blue velvet, bound tight with a cord of braided silver silk. She didn't wait for Vanya to descend. She shouted up toward the gallery, her voice rich and hearty, filling the hollow spaces of the lighthouse with a warmth that smelled of static crackle and cinnamon. By the time Vanya reached the beach, Jamoke had already dropped the parcel onto the shale with a heavy, metal-sharp clink. She stood with her hands on her hips, her eyes sparkling with the residue of a dozen different horizons. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Vanya," she exclaimed, her voice booming in the quiet air. "Or perhaps just a very boring Tuesday? Tell me you've had something more exciting than polishing brass since I last docked." Vanya paused, his voice barely a whisper. "The star," it spoke back. "Jamoke? And something else is there, something silver." Jamoka waved a hand dismissively, though her humming stopped for a brief second. "The cosmos is always chatting, Vanya. Most people just forget how to listen. Now, forget the stars for a moment. You should have seen it, the city of Aurelis, a floating spire of glass and wind where they trade in bottled echoes. I spent 3 hours arguing with a merchant who tried to sell me the sound of a first kiss from a century ago. Imagine! He had it in a little cobalt vial, corked with beeswax. I told him I only deal in things that can be touched, not things that only vibrate in the throat. She leaned in, her expression turning conspiratorial. "But this," she gestured to the velvet-wrapped mass on the stones, "this is a real prize. A commission from the outer rim." The courier who brought it to me looked like he hadn't slept since the Great Alignment. He wouldn't even let go of the parcel until I promised it would go to a repairman who knows how to treat an object with dignity. Vanya knelt by the parcel. He felt a strange magnetic pull emanating from the velvet, a frequency that resonated with the humming warmth still lingering in his chest from his encounter with the radio. He carefully untied the silver cord, the fabric sliding away to reveal a mirror. The frame was not wood or metal, but iridescent bone, carved into intricate swirling patterns that looked like frozen smoke. The bone shifted colors as he moved: pearl, amethyst, then a sudden shocking flash of violet. He lifted the mirror, expecting to see the gray shale of the beach and his own pale, tired face reflected back. Instead, he saw nothing of the lighthouse. There was no reflection of the salt-sprayed tower or the obsidian sky. The glass held a window into another world. He stared into a breathtaking landscape of floating obsidian spires that pierced a sky of deep, vibrant violet, the exact, unmistakable hue of the blinking star. The spires drifted like slow-motion icebergs in a sea of amethyst clouds, and the light was soft, diffused, as if the sun of that world were filtered through a veil of silk. As Vanya stared, a sudden, piercing chill radiated from the glass. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a frequency, a sharp, crystalline vibration that leaped from the mirror into the surrounding air. In the lighthouse gallery above, the music box he had mended days prior, the one that had absorbed so much loneliness, suddenly chimed. It was a spontaneous, frantic melody, a series of high, discordant notes that sounded like a plea. The music box was reacting to the mirror, two foreign frequencies colliding in the narrow space of the tower. "Where are you looking?" Jamoke asked, her voice softening. She stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. "Vanya, you've gone completely still." Vanya didn't answer. He couldn't. His gaze was locked on the distance within the mirror. He noticed a movement, a flicker of something shifting between the obsidian spires. It wasn't a bird or a cloud, it was a deliberate motion, a silhouette moving against the violet backdrop. He realized with a jolt of electricity through his spine that he wasn't looking at a recording or a magical illusion. The perspective shifted as he tilted the mirror. The spires moved in parallax. The clouds drifted in real time. This wasn't a reflection. It was a window. The violet star wasn't a distant burning ball of gas or a celestial anomaly. It was a place. A tangible, living world with gravity and wind and stone. The star was the light of a sun, and the blinking he had witnessed was not a code, but perhaps the rhythm of a world breathing, or a beacon calling out across the void to find a matching frequency. He leaned closer, the cold of the bone frame numbing his fingertips. He pressed his palm against the glass, feeling a faint, rhythmic thrum that matched the heartbeat of the star. The mirror seemed to pull at him, inviting him to lean further into the violet haze. He felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of displacement, as if the lighthouse were the illusion and the obsidian spires were the only true thing in existence. Then, the figure in the mirror stopped. It had been a smudge of dark gray against the purple sky. But as Vanya leaned in, the figure turned. It was humanoid, draped in garments that shimmered like oil on water. The figure didn't just move, it looked directly through the glass, locking eyes with Vanya across an impossible distance. The figure's eyes were not white or brown, but glowing spheres of the same violet light that saturated the sky. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. The roar of the skiff's idling engine faded. Jamoka's breathing became a distant echo. There was only the stare, a gaze of profound, ancient recognition. The figure didn't smile or wave. It simply watched him with an intensity that felt like a physical weight pressing against Vanya's chest. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised a hand and touched the glass from the other side, exactly where Vanya's palm rested. A spark of silver light, identical to the ghostly observer Vanya had seen in the sky, flared between their fingers at the point of contact. The mirror vibrated violently, a low hum that rattled the shale beneath Vanya's boots, and then the image snapped shut, leaving him staring at his own reflection, pale, wide-eyed, and utterly alone on a gray beach. The geometry of breath. And that is why the Mercury seas don't possess a traditional shoreline, but rather a series of undulating tidal shelves that mirror the celestial drift, Lin Yingwen said, her voice a melodic chime that cut through the heavy silence of the workshop. She didn't wait for a response before she swept a series of vellum blueprints across Vanya's workbench, scattering a collection of brass gears and a half-disassembled chronometer. The maps were intricate, etched in a shimmering, iridescent ink that seemed to shift as the light hit it. They weren't maps of land, but of sound-acoustic cartography that visualized the echoes of the outer rim as topographical ridges and valleys. Vanya stepped back, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a slow, unconscious circle, his eyes lingering on the mirror still resting against the wall. The glass was dark now, a dead slab of silver, but the ghost of that violet touch still felt like a brand on his palm. "I've spent 3 months tracking the resonance of the Mercury shelves," Lynn continued, her finger tracing a jagged line on the vellum. "The frequencies are consistent, predictable, which is why the anomalies coming from this lighthouse are so statistically offensive. They aren't signals, Vanya. They are irregularities, noise." Vanya looked at her, his voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't feel like noise. It feels like a conversation." Lynn stopped. She adjusted her glasses with a single sharp flick of her finger. "Feelings are sensory biases, Vanya. They are the ghosts we project onto the void to make the loneliness more bearable. We are dealing with a celestial body of immense mass and energy. It doesn't have feelings, it has properties." She moved with a sudden kinetic energy, pulling a crate of precision sensors from her gear. They were small, obsidian-colored spheres with metal tang filaments that looked like frozen lightning. She began to distribute them around the base of the Great Lantern, her movements precise and clinical. She wanted to quantify the blinking of the violet star, to strip away the mystery and replace it with a spreadsheet of intervals and amplitudes. Vanya watched her, feeling the rhythmic silence of the room being eroded by the clicking of her equipment and the rapid-fire cadence of her speech. It was as if she were trying to build a wall of logic between him and the star. "Look at this," Vanya said, gesturing toward the mirror. He wanted to tell her about the figure, the violet eyes, the spark of silver light that had nearly knocked him unconscious. He wanted to ask if the acoustic cartography of the Mercury seas included a window into another world. Lynn didn't even glance at the mirror. She was hunched over a portable monitor, her eyes darting across a scrolling waterfall of green data. "The mirror is a fascinating piece of craftsmanship, no doubt, but it's a static object. The star is the variable. If we can isolate the exact frequency of the pulses, we can determine if it's a pulsar, a binary collapse, or a malfunctioning beacon. We don't need a mirror to see the truth, we need a graph." "The truth isn't always a graph," Vanya murmured, though he knew the words were falling on deaf ears. For the next hour, the workshop became a battlefield of philosophies. Lynn's presence was a whirlwind of productivity, her voice rising in a precise academic crescendo as she explained the necessity of standardization. She spoke of the Bureau of Beacons, of the elegance of a solved equation, and the inefficiency of resonant mending which relied on the intuition of the repairman, rather than the physics of the material. Vanya didn't argue, he simply listened, his silence acting as a sponge for her intensity. He felt the tension in his chest, a tightness that mirrored the pressure he'd felt when the figure in the mirror had touched his hand. He wondered if Lynn would see the figure as a biological anomaly to be categorized, or if she would be terrified by the fact that the universe was looking back at her. "The intervals are drifting," Lynn said suddenly. The melodic quality of her voice had flattened. Vanya paused his polishing of a brass valve. "Drifting how?" "They aren't constant. I expected a linear decay or a steady oscillation. But this," she zoomed in on the data stream, her glasses slipping slightly down her nose. "The pulses are following a sinusoidal curve. It's an expansion and a contraction. A slow, rhythmic swell." She began to type rapidly, her fingers drumming a frantic rhythm on the keys. She was searching for a mathematical precedent, a known astronomical phenomenon that mimicked this specific curve. Vanya watched her face. The confidence that had defined her since she stepped off the cloud skiff was beginning to crack. Her brow furrowed, and she stopped typing, staring at the screen as if the numbers were suddenly written in a language she had forgotten how to read. "It can't be," she whispered. "The expansion phase is too long. The contraction is too shallow. It doesn't fit the model of a collapsing star or a rotating pulsar. The geometry is organic." Vanya stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder. He didn't look at the numbers. He studied the wave. It looked like a heartbeat. It looked like the rise and fall of a chest in a deep, dreamless sleep. He felt a sudden surge of warmth, a recognition that transcended the data. He remembered the thrumming of the mirror, the way the violet light had felt less like a color and more like a presence. "It's not a code, Lynn," Vanya said softly. "It's not a signal being sent from point A to point B. There is no message to decrypt." Lynn turned to him, her expression stripped of its clinical armor. She looked small beneath the towering shadow of the lantern. "Then what is it? Why would a star move like this?" "It's breathing," Vanya replied. Lynn stared at the monitor, the green light reflecting in her lenses. The paradox had finally broken through her defenses. The idea of a sentient, breathing star was an impossibility, a fantasy that belonged in the stories Jumoke told while unloading cargo. Yet, the math was stubborn. The curve was undeniable. The star wasn't blinking in a language of light. It was inhaling and exhaling across the vacuum of space, a biological function scaled to the size of a solar system. Lynn reached out to adjust the sensor sensitivity, her hand trembling slightly. She refreshed the data stream, pulling the most recent pulses from the void. As the new wave formed on the screen, she went pale. The curve had changed. The peak of the expansion was lower than the last, and the contraction was lagging, stretching out into a long, labored plateau. She leaned back, her chair scraping harshly against the stone floor. She looked up at the ceiling, as if she could see through the layers of iron and glass to the violet light hanging in the blackness above them. "Vanya," she whispered, her voice devoid of its usual precision. "The breathing. It's slowing down." The tuning fork of the void. Vanya pressed the palms of his hands flat against the interior wall of the lantern room, the cold shale biting into his skin. He closed his eyes, shutting out the flicker of Lynn's monitors and the frantic green lines of the failing heartbeat. For a long moment, there was nothing but the smell of old static crackle and the distant, rhythmic click of Rajat's pocket watch echoing from the corridor. Then he felt it, a shudder, so low it was less a sound and more a displacement of air, a heavy, subterranean thrum that vibrated through the marrow of his wrists. "Don't listen with your ears, Vanya," Sana's voice drifted through the room. She sounded as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well, her tone airy and distant, though she stood only a few feet away. "The ears are for the wind and the chatter of machines. To hear the beacon, you must listen with your skin. Let the stone tell you what the light cannot." Vanya shifted his weight, rubbing his thumb against his index finger in a slow, circular motion. He tried to sink into the vibration, but his mind was a storm of mechanical checklists. He was thinking of the celestial radio, the hand organ, the precise tension of the brass springs, and the way the violet star's breath had plateaued on Lynn's screen. He wanted to reach into the void with a wrench and a soldering iron. He wanted to tighten a bolt in the sky until the rhythm returned to its proper cadence. "It's closing," Sana whispered. Her form was a pale smudge against the gray stone, her head tilted slightly to the left as if catching a frequency Vanya was missing. "Can you feel it? A heart closing like a rusted hinge." "It is a heavy, grinding sound. the sound of a door shutting on a world that isn't ready to be left behind. As she spoke, Vanya felt a sudden, oppressive weight settle across his chest, as if a physical slab of granite had been laid upon his ribs. It wasn't the weight of the building, but the weight of his own desperation. The friction of his need to solve the problem as one solves a broken clock, created a static in his chest that drowned out the subtle pulse of the walls. He gasped, his fingers slipping against the damp shale, his breath coming in short, jagged bursts. He was fighting the star, trying to force the universe back into a shape he understood, and the effort felt like trying to hold back the tide with a sieve. "You are gripping the silence too tightly," Sana observed. She moved toward him, her footsteps making no sound on the floor, her transparency fluctuating like a dying lamp. "You treat the void as a patient on a table, Vanya. But the void is not a thing to be mended. It is a conversation to be joined." Vanya pulled his hands away from the wall, his palms tingling. "If the breathing slows, the star dies. If the star dies, the light goes. I can't just listen to it vanish, Sana. There has to be a mechanism, a frequency we can broadcast to jumpstart the rhythm. There is always a gear that can be turned." Sana let out a soft melodic sigh that sounded like wind through a flute. She floated toward the center of the room, where the great lens of the beacon cast a pale, refracted glow across the floor. "You spent your life among clocks thinking that time is a series of teeth and springs. But this place, this lighthouse, is not a clock. It is a tuning fork." Vanya frowned, the word hanging in the air. "A tuning fork?" "The beacon was not built to warn ships away from the rocks," Sana explained, her voice gaining a momentary resonance that filled the room. "It was designed to anchor sentient entities across the void. The violet star is not merely a celestial body, it is a consciousness, tethered to this point in space by the resonance of the beacon. The lighthouse provides the steady hum, the baseline frequency that allows a mind as vast as a star to remain stable in a chaotic universe." She turned to him, her eyes shimmering with a faded, ancient light. "But the anchor is not made of iron or stone, Vanya. It is made of the keeper. The beacon only holds if the keeper's heart remains open and resonant. The lighthouse amplifies the emotional state of the one who tends it. If the keeper becomes rigid, if they close themselves off in fear or retreat into the shell of solitude, the frequency shifts. The anchor begins to slip." Vanya felt a coldness seep into his gut, more profound than the chill of the shale. He thought of the years he had spent in the silence of Orizon, the way he had cherished the isolation, the way he had built a wall of quiet around himself to escape the noise of the world he had left behind. He had viewed his loneliness as a sanctuary, a clean room where he could exist without the friction of other people. He realized now that his sanctuary had been a fortress, and that in his pursuit of ultimate silence, he had been inadvertently dampening the very signal the star needed to survive. He had wanted to be alone, and in doing so, he had begun to pull the star into the silence with him. Sana's image flickered violently. For a second she vanished entirely, leaving only a faint scent of night bloom scent and old paper in the air, before reappearing as a translucent ghost, more transparent than she had been in years. Her hand reached out toward him, but it passed through his shoulder like a breath of cold mist. "The star's fading breath is a reflection of the anchor's instability," she warned, her voice now a thin, fragile thread. "The resonance is breaking because you have forgotten how to be open. You have treated your heart like one of your trinkets, something to be polished and kept in a velvet box, safe from the touch of the world." Vanya looked at his hands, the hands of a repairman, scarred by slips of the knife and burns from the solder. He had spent so long fixing the external world that he hadn't noticed the rust forming on his own capacity to feel. He felt a sudden, terrifying vulnerability, as if the walls of the lighthouse had turned to glass and the entire vacuum of space was staring in at him. Sana drifted closer, her expression one of profound, distant sadness. The light from the violet star above seemed to dim, the purple hue shifting toward a bruised, heavy gray. The silence in the room grew thick, no longer the cozy silence of a library, but the suffocating silence of a tomb. "Tell me, Vanya," Sana whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant, labored thrum of the walls. "What happens to the world when the heart that holds it finally stops?" Before he could answer, a sharp, metal-sharp clang echoed from the stairs. Rajat had arrived, his boots clicking with military precision on the stone, his pocket watch snapping shut with a finality that sounded like a gavel. He entered the room with a look of clinical disapproval, glancing from the trembling Vanya to the fading ghost of Sana. The frequency is drifting further, Rajat announced, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. The structural integrity of the resonance is failing. I've already begun drafting a proposal for a mechanical stabilizer. We don't need a keeper who listens to stones, Vanya. We need a system that doesn't breathe. Vanya didn't look at him. He kept his palms pressed against the wall, feeling the heartbeat of the star grow slower, heavier, and more distant, as if it were drifting away into a night from which no light could return. The efficiency of silence. The calipers clicked with the surgical precision of a guillotine. Rajat did not look at Vanya as he measured the distance between the central resonator and the outer wall, his movements a series of right angles and calculated pauses. He moved through the workshop not as a guest, but as a surveyor mapping a territory that had been allowed to grow wild. In his wake, the cozy chaos of Vanya's sanctuary, the piles of disassembled chronometers, the jars of iridescent oil, the hand organ with its velvet bellows seemed to shrink, becoming mere clutter in the face of a stopwatch that snapped shut every 10 minutes with a sound like a closing cell door. 3 millimeters of drift in the primary axis, Rajat announced, his voice a flat line of sound that left no room for interpretation. He didn't turn around, he simply noted the discrepancy into a leather-bound ledger with a pen that never bled. The structural variance is unacceptable. You've been treating this facility like a potting shed, Vanya. This is a beacon. It is a functional node in a celestial network, yet you operate it with the haphazard intuition of a village herbalist. Vanya stood by the workbench, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a rapid circular motion. He wanted to speak, to explain that the drift was not an error but a breath, the lighthouse leaning toward the violet star in a slow gravitational dance. But the words felt heavy and useless. He watched the objects on his table, a music box that played memories of rain, a compass that pointed toward longing. To Rajat, these were not artifacts of the soul. They were malfunctions awaiting a standard. Resonant mending is not haphazard, Vanya whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. It requires listening. If you force the frequency, you break the essence of the object. You cannot fix a heart by tightening a screw. Rajat finally turned, his expression one of mild, clinical curiosity, as if he were observing a particularly stubborn species of insect. He adjusted his glasses and looked Vanya in the eye, though the gaze felt devoid of any one person. Essence is a poetic term for lack of data, Vanya. What you call listening is merely an unquantifiable mysticism. It is inefficient, it is unpredictable, and most importantly, it is not scalable. The Bureau does not pay for intuition, it pays for uptime. Without waiting for a rebuttal, Rajat moved toward the iridescent shale floors. He carried a heavy case of matte black equipment, industrial stabilizers designed to anchor a structure to the bedrock of reality. Vanya stepped forward, a sudden spike of protective anxiety tightening his throat, but Rajat had already begun. The inspector knelt and drove the first stabilizer into the glowing shale with a pneumatic hiss. The sound was a violent intrusion, a sterile mechanical scream that tore through the silence of the room. Sana, who had been drifting near the celestial radio like a plume of incense, flickered. Her translucent form shuddered, the edges of her dress blurring into static. She tilted her head, listening to the new sound, and for the first time, Vanya saw a look of genuine alarm on her ethereal face. As Rajat hammered the second and third stabilizers into the floor, the rhythmic thrum of the island, the heartbeat Vanya had spent years learning, was drowned out by a high-frequency whine. Sana vanished. She didn't fade slowly this time. She was simply erased, snuffed out by the wall of sterile noise, as if the stabilizers had built a fence that a ghost could not cross. "Stop it," Vanya said, his voice cracking. "You're killing the resonance." "I am optimizing the foundation," Rajat replied, his tone remaining crisp. He stood up and walked toward a broken clock on Vanya's workbench, a piece of silver filigree that had been weeping a slow, metal-sharp oil for weeks. Vanya had been mending it for a month, waiting for the clock's internal rhythm to align with his own. Rajat didn't wait. He reached into his kit and produced a sonic pulse emitter, a handheld device that looked like a polished chrome cylinder. "Watch," Rajat said. He pressed the emitter against the silver casing and triggered a burst of high-frequency sound. The clock didn't just start ticking, it jolted. The silver filigree groaned, the metal straining against a force that demanded immediate compliance. There was a sound like a stifled sob, a sharp metal-sharp snap, and the hands of the clock leaped forward, locking into a rigid, perfect synchronization. The weeping oil stopped instantly. The clock was fixed in the most clinical sense of the word, but as Vanya looked at it, he felt a hollow void where the object's personality had been. The clock was no longer a story. It was a machine. It had been forced into a state of obedience, its emotional distress silenced by the sheer volume of the pulse. Vanya felt a cold shiver slide down his spine. He reached out to touch the clock, but the metal felt frigid, dead. He studied Rajat, who was already checking his pocket watch, satisfied with the result. The inspector's efficiency was a vacuum, sucking the air and the magic out of the room, replacing the dreamlike haze of Orizon with the gray light of a factory floor. There, Rajat said. Standardized. Predictable. Fixed. But the victory was short-lived. As Rajat stepped back to admire his work, a low, guttural groan vibrated through the soles of Vanya's boots. It wasn't the melodic hum of the star or the gentle sigh of the wind. It was the sound of something massive and ancient being crushed. Vanya looked down at the iridescent shale. From the base of the black stabilizers, thin, jagged cracks were spreading. They weren't random. They were spiderwebs of fracture racing outward across the floor, splitting the glowing stone into shards. The stabilizers were not anchoring the lighthouse to the island. They were too rigid. The island of Orizon was a living thing, a piece of celestial debris that breathed and shifted in response to the violet star. By forcing it into a fixed position, Rajat had created a point of catastrophic tension. The island was trying to move, but the stabilizers were holding it fast, and the shale was the only thing that could give. Another groan echoed from the depths, louder this time, shaking the jars of oil on the shelves and rattling the hand organ. Vanya felt the floor tilt slightly, a sickening lurch that made the room spin. He realized with a jolt of terror that the mechanical stabilizers weren't providing stability at all. They were acting as wedges, splitting the very foundation of the beacon apart. The readings are stable, Rajat murmured, frowning at his ledger, oblivious to the cracks racing toward his boots. The frequency is perfectly locked. It's not locked, Vanya whispered, his thumb rubbing his finger so hard the skin turned red. It's breaking. Just then, a sharp, crystalline crack echoed through the workshop, and a piece of the iridescent floor snapped upward, narrowly missing Rajat's heel. Beneath the gap, there was no solid rock. Only a swirling violet void that exhaled a wind smelling of static crackle and ancient grief. The lighthouse didn't just shake, it shivered, as if the island itself were screaming in pain under the weight of the iron teeth Rajat had sunk into its heart. The compass of moments. The needle was a frantic silver blur, spinning with such velocity that it ceased to look like a physical object and became a shimmering halo of desperation. Vanya leaned over the workbench, his breath hitching in the small, stale space between his face and the brass housing of the celestial compass. The tool didn't just spin, it shivered. Every few seconds the needle would jerk violently toward the east, then whip back toward the void, as if it were trying to read a language that was being shouted over by 1,000 screams. Behind him, the humming of Rajat's stabilizers had shifted from a low drone to a predatory thrum. The machines were gorging themselves on the island's natural energy, converting the fluid, dreaming grace of Orizon into a rigid, quantifiable grid. Vanya could feel the interference in the marrow of his bones, a metal-sharp taste, like sucking on a metal tang coin, that coated the back of his throat. He rubbed his thumb against his index finger in a slow, rhythmic circle, trying to find a frequency that didn't feel like a serrated blade. "It is an obsolete instrument, Vanya," Rajat said. The inspector's voice was as crisp as a freshly pressed shirt, devoid of any jagged edges. He didn't look up from his ledger, his hand moving with mechanical precision to wind his pocket watch. The click, click, click of the spring was a tiny, rhythmic punctuation to the chaos of the room. The erratic behavior is a symptom of mechanical failure. The pivot is likely worn or the magnetic shielding has degraded. It is simply broken. Vanya didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the silver blur. "It isn't broken," he whispered, his voice barely a ripple in the air. "It's reacting. It's trying to find a center that you pushed too far away." "A center is a mathematical coordinate, not a feeling," Rajat replied. He finally stepped forward, the heels of his polished boots clicking on the iridescent shale, which was still webbed with the hairline fractures from the previous day. He reached into his coat and produced a sleek, matte black device, a digital chronometer with a screen that glowed with a cold, sterile blue light. "I can replace this antiquity with a synchronized chronometer. It will give you the exact time, the exact position, and the exact atmospheric pressure of the sector. It doesn't spin, it informs." Vanya pulled the compass closer to his chest, shielding it as if it were a wounded bird. The brass was cold, but beneath the metal he could feel a faint, rhythmic shudder. To Rajat, this was a tool for navigation. To Vanya, the compass was a stethoscope. For years, the needle had tracked the slow, tidal breath of the violet star, moving not by magnetic north, but by the pull of a sentient heart. If he let the chronometer replace the compass, he wouldn't just be upgrading a tool, he would be cutting the last physical thread connecting him to the silence of the void. "I don't want to be informed," Vanya said, his voice gaining a rare, fragile edge. "I want to listen. There is a difference between knowing where a thing is and knowing that it is still there." Rajat paused, his brow furrowing. The concept of listening to a piece of brass seemed to offend his sense of systemic optimization. "You are romanticizing a malfunction. The Bureau of Beacons does not pay for poetry, Vanya. They pay for stability. Your insistence on these intuitive repairs is precisely why the beacon's efficiency has dropped by 12% this quarter." "Efficiency is a ghost," Vanya murmured, though he knew the argument was a circle they had walked a dozen times. He shifted his weight, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath him. The island was still protesting the stabilizers, a slow, geological groan that vibrated through the soles of his boots. He ignored Rajat and closed his eyes, letting the noise of the machines recede into a background blur. He began to hum, a low, vibrating tone that matched the deepest frequency of the violet star, a sound he had learned from the echoes of Sana al-Farsi. As he hummed, he slowly adjusted the tension screw on the compass's outer rim. He wasn't looking for a setting, he was looking for a feeling. He felt the point where the tension met the interference, a shimmering friction that made the hair on his arm stand up. He breathed out, a long, slow exhale, and shifted the needle's housing by a fraction of a millimeter. Suddenly, the spinning stopped. The silence that followed was instantaneous and heavy. The needle didn't drift, it snapped into place with a sharp, metal-sharp click that echoed in the quiet workshop. Vanya opened his eyes. The needle wasn't pointing toward the horizon, nor was it pointing toward the star hanging in the violet sky. It was pointing straight down, piercing the center of the compass dial. Then it began to move. Not in a circle, but in a pulse. The needle jumped upward and then dipped back down, a rhythmic, steady beat. Thump, 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 thump. "What is that?" Rajat asked, leaning in, his curiosity momentarily overriding his disdain. "Is it a gravitational anomaly? A localized tremor?" "It's a heartbeat," Vanya whispered. He felt a surge of warmth in his chest, a sudden, piercing intimacy. The compass wasn't navigating space, it was navigating life. He could feel the star's rhythm, slow, tired, but persisting. It was a lifeline, a tangible proof that the entity in the void was not just a ball of gas and light, but a presence that breathed. Rajat's face hardened. To him, an anomaly was a flaw to be corrected. He didn't see a heartbeat, he saw a variable that didn't belong in a standardized system. "This is an irregular reading. It's likely a feedback loop caused by the stabilizer's interaction with the shale. I can adjust the frequency to dampen this oscillation." "Don't," Vanya said, his voice sharp. "Rajat, leave it alone. It's stable. It's finally stable." But Rajat was already turning toward the main control panel of the stabilizers. He believed he was saving the instrument. In his mind, he was removing the noise to reveal the truth. He reached for the primary dial and twisted it sharply to the right, attempting to correct the harmonic interference. The result was not a correction, but a collision. As the stabilizers surged, a screech of tortured metal ripped through the air, a sound so violent it felt like a physical blow to the ears. A blinding flash of white light erupted from the base of the machines, arching across the room in jagged bolts of static. The feedback loop hit the compass like a hammer. Vanya watched in horror as the silver needle began to vibrate with a frequency that blurred the air around it. The rhythmic pulsing accelerated, turning into a frantic, high-pitched scream of metal. "Stop it!" Vanya yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the crescendo of the machines. With a final crystalline snap, the silver needle sheared off. The sound was small compared to the roar of the stabilizers, but to Vanya it sounded like a bone breaking. The needle flew across the room, clattering uselessly against the iridescent floor. Silence returned, sudden and suffocating. Vanya looked up at the window. The violet light that had bathed the lighthouse for centuries, the soft, comforting glow of the star, had vanished. The sky was a flat, hollow black, as if a curtain had been drawn over the universe. Vanya looked down at the empty housing of the compass, then at the darkness outside, and felt a void open in his own chest that no amount of mending could ever fix. The weight of a broken thing. Vanya didn't look at the empty housing of the compass. Instead, he stepped across the iridescent floor, his boots clicking softly, and stopped inches from Rajat. The air in the workshop still tasted of static crackle and burnt metal tang, a sharp, sharp tang that clung to the back of the throat. Vanya's hand was steady as he reached for a velvet-lined tray on the workbench, retrieving a memory sphere that had arrived in Jumoki's last shipment. It was a fragile thing, a globe of hand-blown glass no larger than a pomegranate, now spiderwebbed with fractures. From these cracks, a thick, sorrowful gray mist leaked in slow, languid curls, pooling on the table like heavy cream. "Hold this," Vanya said. His voice was a ghost of a whisper, stripped of its usual warmth, leaving only a cold, rhythmic precision. Rajat recoiled slightly, his hand instinctively moving to the pocket watch in his waistcoat. He wound it once, the metal sharp click, 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 a desperate attempt to reclaim the cadence of a world that made sense. "I fail to see how an unstable storage vessel contributes to the recovery of the needle. The sphere is structurally compromised. It belongs in a containment field, not in my hands." "It doesn't need a field. It needs to be heard," Vanya replied. He didn't wait for consent. He stepped forward and pressed the cold, leaking glass into Rajat's palms. For a moment, Rajat held it with the tips of his fingers as if the object were caustic. He studied the gray mist with a clinical detachment, his brow furrowed in a frown of systemic analysis. "The vapor is likely a byproduct of the mnemonic degradation. If we can stabilize the pressure within the sphere, we can probably crystallize the remaining data and—" "Stop thinking," Vanya interrupted. He moved behind Rajat, his voice drifting over the other man's shoulder. "You are trying to solve a puzzle that isn't made of pieces. Stop calculating the volume of the mist and listen to the weight of it. Close your eyes, Rajat. Just breathe. Not the way you breathe when you're counting seconds, but the way you breathe when you've forgotten who you are." Rajat stiffened. The very idea of forgetting himself, of relinquishing the rigid architecture of his mind, was an affront. But the silence of the lighthouse, now that the violet light was gone, was oppressive. The darkness outside the windows felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. Slowly, reluctantly, Rajat closed his eyes. He kept his shoulders squared, his posture a fortress of industrial discipline, but his fingers tightened around the sphere. "Synchronize," Vanya murmured. "The sphere isn't humming. It's sobbing. Can you feel the pulse? It's slow. It's dying. Match it." At first, Rajat fought it. He tried to categorize the sensation, to label the rhythmic throb of the glass as a simple harmonic oscillation. But as he breathed, the gray mist began to wrap around his wrists, cooling his skin. Suddenly, the barrier broke. The emotional mirroring hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow to the solar plexus. The sphere didn't just share a memory, it forced a perspective. He was no longer in the workshop. He was standing in a doorway of a house that smelled of cinnamon and old paper, watching a door close for the last time. He felt the sudden echoing emptiness of a hallway where laughter used to live. It was the crushing gravity of a home that had become a museum of absences, the precise moment when a place stops being a sanctuary and starts being a reminder of what is gone. Inside Vanya, a sudden spike of empathy flared. He is so terrified of the void that he built a machine out of his own personality, Vanya thought, watching the tremor start in Rajat's jaw. He thinks that if he can just measure the world, he can prevent it from hurting him. But the world is not a blueprint. It is a wound that never quite closes, and he is holding the salt in his hands. Rajat's breath hitched. The rigid line of his spine collapsed, his shoulders slouching as if an invisible hand had pushed him down. A sound escaped him. A jagged, raw noise that started as a gasp and ended as a sob. It was a sound devoid of mechanical precision. A human noise that sounded like something breaking. He clutched the sphere to his chest, the gray mist now swirling violently around him, feeding on the sudden openness of his grief. "Why?" Rajat's voice was shredded, the authoritative tone gone, replaced by a vulnerability that made him seem smaller, younger. "Why does it feel so heavy? It's just glass. It's just gas and glass. Why does it feel like I'm carrying the weight of an entire city?" "Because you're finally feeling the actual mass of the loss," Vanya said softly, his thumb rubbing against his index finger in a slow, rhythmic circle. "Logic is a light shell, Rajat. Grief is the stone beneath it." But the sudden surge of raw, unfiltered emotion from Rajat acted as an unplanned catalyst. The workshop was a delicate ecosystem of resonance, and Rajat's emotional collapse sent a shockwave through the room. The memory sphere flared, the gray mist turning a blinding electric white. The energy didn't dissipate, it arched. It leaped from the sphere to the nearby mechanical stabilizers, the very machines Rajat had tried to correct earlier. There was no scream of metal this time, only a low, hungry thrum. The stabilizers began to glow, the white light intensifying until it was a searing, solid wall of brilliance. With a sound like a collapsing star, the machinery overloaded. A blinding flash erupted, and the smell of melting iron filled the air. When the light faded, the stabilizers were no longer machines. They had been fused into a singular, useless mass of slag, a twisted sculpture of blackened metal and cooling glass. Silence returned, but it was a fragile, lying silence. Beneath their feet, a deep, guttural groan vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of shale screaming under impossible tension. "What was that?" Rajat asked, wiping his face with a shaking hand, his eyes wide and unfocused. Vanya didn't answer. He felt the floor tilt. It was subtle at first, a slight lean to the left, but then it accelerated. A violent jolt rocked the lighthouse, throwing them both against the wall. Outside, a sound like a mountain splitting in two echoed across the void. Vanya rushed to the window and looked down. He gasped. A massive chunk of the shale island, the very foundation that held the beacon of Orizon aloft, had sheared off. He watched as a section of the cliff, the size of a cathedral, slid silently into the mercury seas below, disappearing into the shimmering, toxic liquid without a splash. The lighthouse groaned again, tilting at a precarious, dizzying angle. Vanya gripped the windowsill, his knuckles white. As he looked toward the horizon, he realized the tilt wasn't just a lean. The remaining fragment of the island was no longer stationary. The loss of the stabilizers and the sudden shift in mass had broken the equilibrium. The island had begun to drift, sliding rapidly and irrevocably toward the crushing depths of the Mercury Sea, carrying them both down into the shimmering dark. The grand synchronization. The floor was no longer a floor, it was a slide. Vanya slammed into a mahogany bookshelf, a landslide of leather-bound journals cascading over him. The beacon of Orizon was tilting at a sickening 20-degree angle, the sound, a grinding scream of shale meeting liquid mercury, vibrating through the soles of his boots. He scrambled up, fingers slipping on polished wood, while the scent of scorched iron from the fused stabilizers hung heavy in the air. "Get away from the window!" Rajat shouted. The inspector clung to a brass railing, knuckles white, his pocket watch swinging wildly. He looked less like a man of logic and more like a frightened bird, his voice cracking under the strain. Lynn was already on the floor, sliding toward the edge of the room. She wasn't watching the abyss, but her acoustic maps, translucent vellum covered in shifting iridescent ink. She pressed her ear to the floorboards. "The resonance is shifting," she called out. "We're slipping into a harmonic dead zone. If we don't signal the star now, the Mercury Sea will swallow the foundation." Vanya crawled toward the celestial radio, a wreckage of brass tubes and glowing filaments buried under fallen books. He reached for the dial, but a spark snapped against his skin. The radio was dead, its internal crystals shattered by the surge that had claimed the stabilizers. "The radio is gone, Lynn," Vanya whispered. "It's not gone, it's just muted," Lynn countered, sliding toward him. She pointed to a jagged peak in the frequency graph. "The star is still pulsing. The energy is still in the room. The static is humming in the walls." Rajat lunged toward them, his boots skidding. He ignored the star, focusing instead on the slagged remains of the stabilizers. He saw the blackened metal, not as a failure, but as raw material. "The stabilizers were designed to dampen vibration," Rajat said, his authoritative tone returning. "If we strip the metal tang coils from the wreckage and bypass the primary capacitors, we can create a temporary amplifier. We can't send a steady stream, but we can send a burst." One violent scream of a signal. Vanya watched as Rajat tore into the machinery with mechanical precision, the screech of steel on steel echoing the island's descent. Rajat wasn't talking about harmony, he was talking about voltage. He was stripping the very things he had tried to correct to save them. Vanya felt a sudden kinship with the man. Both were now desperate enough to break things further to make them work. As Rajat worked, a warmth blossomed in the room. Vanya turned to see Sana. She was more transparent than usual, her edges blurring into the violet haze seeping through the floorboards. She looked directly at Vanya, her head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. "The metal tang will carry the spark, Vanya, but not the meaning." Sana's voice drifted from the bottom of a deep well. The star does not respond to electricity. It responds to a heartbeat. The signal requires a living bridge to translate the machine's scream into a soul's plea. Vanya looked at the makeshift array, a chaotic web of wires and coils snaking toward the antenna. He understood. The machine was a megaphone. It needed a voice. He studied his own hands, the hands of a clockmaker who had spent his life absorbing the grief of broken trinkets. He had always been a vessel for the lost. "I'll do it," Vanya said. "You can't survive a direct surge of that magnitude," Lynn warned. "The electrical load alone—" "It's not electrical," Vanya interrupted, his gaze fixed on the violet light. "It's resonance." He stepped into the center of the array. The lighthouse gave another violent lurch, and a spray of mercury water hissed against the lower windows. Time had run out. "Now!" Rajat yelled, slamming the final connection into place. Lynn and Rajat moved instinctively, gripping the edges of the metal tang frame and the radio console. They formed a human chain, grounding the equipment, their breathing falling into a synchronized rhythm Vanya could feel in his marrow. For the first time, the engineer and the archivist were not analyzing the miracle. They were part of it. Vanya closed his eyes. He stopped being Vanya Sokolov, the lonely man in the lighthouse. He opened the doors of his chest and let the frequency of the violet star rush in. It began as a vibration in his teeth, then a roar in his blood. His identity frayed, his consciousness dissolving into a shimmering tide. He was no longer a man, but a chord, a bridge of heartbeat and memory. He felt the star's ancient humming loneliness, and he pushed back with everything he had, every mended clock, every polished gear, every moment of quiet companionship. The surge was blinding. A pillar of pure violet light erupted from the antenna, punching a hole through the ceiling into the velvet sky. The sound was a cosmic roar that silenced the screaming shale and the crashing mercury. For a heartbeat, time stopped. The light washed over the island, a viscous glow that mended the world. Vanya felt the shale beneath them knit back together, the fissures closing with 1,000 sighs. The mercury sea froze into a shimmering, iridescent plane of glass, locked in crystalline peace. As the light receded, Vanya collapsed. He felt the hard, level floor beneath him. The tilt was gone. The lighthouse was still. He lay there for a long time, breathing in the scent of static and lavender. Beside him, Rajat and Lynn remained holding the equipment, their faces illuminated by the fading afterglow. They looked at Vanya with bewildered awe. Vanya turned toward the corner. Sana was gone. There was no shimmer, no echo, only a faint scent of tea and old paper. He looked up through the hole in the ceiling at the violet star which pulsed once, slowly, like a heart beating in the deep. But as the silence settled, Vanya noticed a small, metal-sharp object on the floor beside him. It was a silver needle, humming with a frequency that didn't belong to the star, pointing directly toward the frozen Mercury Sea. The eternal conversation. The amber light of the morning didn't just illuminate the gallery. It seemed to hold Vanya in a suspension of liquid gold. He woke slowly, his cheek pressed against the cool, salt-pitted stone of the floor, feeling a lightness in his chest that bordered on the terrifying. It was as if the surge of violet light had scrubbed the grit from his soul, leaving behind a hollow space that didn't feel like a void, but like a room waiting to be furnished. He didn't move for a long time, watching a single dust mote dance in a shaft of sun, its trajectory erratic and perfect. His thumb brushed against his index finger in a slow, absent circle, but the habit felt less like a tether to reality, and more like a quiet greeting to the world. Across the room, the rhythmic click-clack of a leather suitcase being latched broke the silence. Rajat was packing. He wasn't rushing, nor was he performing the precise military efficiency Vanya had grown accustomed to. Instead, his movements were heavy, almost tentative. He folded a linen shirt with a slow deliberation that suggested he was memorizing the texture of the fabric. The pocket watch, usually wound every 10 minutes with a sharp, metal-sharp snap, remained silent in his vest pocket. Rajat looked over at Vanya, his expression stripped of its bureaucratic armor. "The Bureau expects a report on the structural integrity of the beacon and the synchronization of the radio," Rajat said. His voice was still crisp, but the authoritative edge had softened into something resembling a sigh. He stepped toward Vanya, holding the suitcase handle loosely. "I suspect I shall tell them the facility is perfectly inefficient. I will report that the machinery is governed by whims and heartbeats, and that any attempt to standardize the output would result in a total systemic collapse. They won't understand it, which means they will likely leave us alone for another decade." Vanya pushed himself up, the stone cold against his palms. He didn't speak immediately. He listened to the way the lighthouse breathed, the subtle hum of the walls that now felt like a shared secret. "You're lying for us," Vanya whispered. "I am optimizing the truth," Rajat replied, though a small ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. He looked out toward the frozen Mercury Sea, the iridescent plain still shimmering under the amber sky. "Some things are too fragile to be measured, Vanya. I spent my life believing that if a thing couldn't be quantified, it didn't exist. It turns out the things that cannot be measured are the only ones worth keeping." Lynn was standing by the window, her glasses pushed up onto her forehead. She wasn't looking at Rajat, but at the stacks of notebooks piled on the workbench, months of acoustic cartography, signal decryptions, and mathematical proofs attempting to solve the riddle of the violet star. She reached out and touched the spine of the thickest volume, her finger lingering on the leather. Then, with a sudden decisive motion, she stepped back and left the books where they lay. "The patterns are wrong," Lynn said, her voice melodic but distant. "I spent all night trying to find the sequence, the logic of the blinking. But the star isn't speaking in math, it's speaking in resonance. To archive it is to kill it. You can't put a heartbeat into a ledger." She turned to Vanya, her eyes bright with a strange new clarity. "I'm not going back to the city. I want to stay. Not as an archivist, but as a listener. I want to learn how to hear the things that don't make a sound." Vanya felt a surge of warmth, a kinship that didn't require the dissolution of identity he'd experienced during the surge. He stood and walked toward his workbench, his movements fluid. He reached into a velvet-lined drawer and pulled out a small brass disc. A heartbeat sync charm, a trinket he had been tinkering with for weeks. It was a delicate piece of clockwork, designed to mirror the pulse of whatever it was tuned to. He spent the next hour in a focused silence, his tools clicking softly against the brass. He wasn't just fixing a gear, he was weaving the current stillness of the lighthouse into the metal. As he worked, Vanya felt a spike of interior intensity, a sudden, rushing realization that crashed over him like a wave. "I spent so long fearing the noise of the world, seeking the silence as a fortress," he thought, his fingers steadying the tiny tweezers. But the silence wasn't the goal. The silence was just the clearing of the throat before the song begins. "All these years I thought I was a repairman of broken things, but I was just learning how to listen to the breaks. The gaps are where the light gets in. The malfunctions are the only honest parts of the machine." He felt a momentary vertigo, a sense that his entire life had been a preamble to this specific amber-lit morning. He finished the charm and held it out to Rajat. The brass glowed with a soft internal light, pulsing in time with the slow, rhythmic thrum of the beacon. "For your journey," Vanya said softly, "so you can carry a piece of the peace back with you. When the city gets too loud, just hold this. It will remind you that there is a place where the clocks don't matter." Rajat took the charm, his fingers brushing Vanya's. For a moment, the industrial engineer looked completely lost, his composure fracturing. He didn't wind his watch. He simply closed his hand over the brass disc and nodded, a gesture of profound, silent gratitude. They moved together into the small kitchen area where a pot of tea was already steeping. It was Sana's favorite blend night bloom scent, dried orange peel, and a hint of something metal sharp that smelled like a coming storm. The scent filled the room, mingling with the lingering aroma of old brass and the static crackle-crackle of the radio. Vanya poured the tea into 3 mismatched porcelain cups, the liquid a deep, shimmering gold. They sat in a circle, the silence between them no longer a void to be filled with nervous chatter or technical jargon. It was a heavy, comfortable thing, a shared blanket of understanding. They didn't talk about the silver needle, or the disappearance of Sana, or the terrifying scale of the void. They talked about the taste of the tea and the way the light hit the Mercury Sea. Vanya watched them. The rigid man who had learned to bend, and the analytical woman who had learned to feel, and realized that the lighthouse had mended them just as he mended the trinkets. He leaned back in his wooden chair, the grain of the timber pressing into his spine. He closed his eyes, and as he did, the distance between himself and the sky vanished. He didn't feel the star as a distant celestial body or a signal on a frequency. He felt it as a physical presence, a weightless, humming warmth that rested against his skin like a sleeping cat. It was a slow, rhythmic pressure, a cosmic heartbeat that synchronized with his own. He understood now that the fixing of the star had not been a destination or a task to be completed. There was no final click of a gear, no ultimate resolution of a chord. It was simply the opening of a door. The conversation had begun, and it would last as long as there were heartbeats to sustain it. Vanya let out a long, slow breath, feeling the warmth of the violet stars seep into his marrow, pulling him down into a deep, sleepy contentment. He was no longer alone in the silence. He was part of a dialogue that spanned the emptiness of space, a quiet, eternal conversation that whispered, "I am here, and you are here, and that is enough."